On the 20th of July, 1969, a rocket called Saturn V carried 3 Americans to the surface of the moon. It was the proudest moment of a nation, the ultimate proof that freedom and democracy could out-invent any rival on Earth. What almost no one watching knew was that the machine which took them there had been designed by a man who, 25 years earlier, had built weapons for Adolf Hitler. His name was Wernher von Braun. He had worn the black uniform of the SS. The factory that mass-produced his wartime rockets had been staffed by concentration camp prisoners worked to death by the thousands. And yet here he was, an American hero, the celebrated father of the Saturn V, smiling for the cameras at Cape Canaveral. This is the story of how that happened, of a secret program run by the United States government to take the enemy's most brilliant minds, some of them committed Nazis, erase their pasts on paper and quietly make them citizens. They called it Operation Paperclip, and it forced a question this country has never fully answered. What exactly are we willing to forgive for the sake of winning? To understand the bargain, you have to understand what these men had made. On a remote island on Germany's Baltic coast, at a secret base called Peenemünde, von Braun and a team of gifted engineers had built the most advanced weapon of the Second World War. They called it the V2. It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a 46-foot rocket that climbed to the edge of space and came screaming back down faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning. No air raid siren could help you because the rocket arrived before the sound of it did. It would simply fall out of a clear sky and erase a city block. From 1944, Hitler fired more than 3,000 of them at London and at the Belgian port of Antwerp. Thousands of civilians died. Militarily, the V2 came too late to change the war. It was expensive, and for all its terror, it carried only a single warhead. But it was something the world had never seen. A machine that could reach across the sky and strike a target hundreds of miles away, untouchable. Every rocket that has flown since, every missile, every satellite, every moon landing, descends from that weapon. But there is a darkness beneath the miracle, and it is the part of this story that must never be sanded away. Because after Allied bombers hit Peenemünde, the Nazis moved V2 production underground into a vast tunnel complex carved into a mountain in central Germany called Mittelwerk. The tunnels were dug and the rockets were assembled by prisoners brought from a concentration camp called NARA and worked in conditions designed to kill. They labored in the cold and the dark and the dust with almost no food, no sanitation, and no rest. They were beaten and hanged for the smallest suspicion of sabotage. Historians estimate that around 20,000 prisoners died building the V2, which means, chillingly, that more people died manufacturing the rocket than were ever killed by it as a weapon. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk. He later claimed he was powerless to change what he saw. But the record shows he was there, that he knew, and that when he needed skilled labor, he helped arrange for prisoners to be brought in. That is the man the United States was about to recruit. This is the ledger America chose not to read too closely. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing, and a different kind of war was already beginning. The Americans and the Soviets, allies for now, both understood that the Reich's laboratories held the future. Jet engines, nerve agents, and above all, the rockets. Whoever seized the scientists would inherit the next century of weapons. So, a race began across the ruins of Germany. American intelligence teams fanned out with lists of names, hunting for physicists, chemists, and engineers before the Red Army could reach them. In a quarry, they discovered the crown jewels, 14 tons of V2 documents, the complete blueprints of the program, hidden behind a false wall. In an underground mine, they found enough parts to build 100 rockets. And racing a deadline before the territory was handed to the Soviets, they hauled it all out in a frantic 10 days. The hardware was priceless, but hardware without the minds that built it was just metal. The Americans wanted the men, and the most important man of all had already decided he wanted the Americans. Von Braun was no fool. As the Reich crumbled around him, he gathered his inner circle and coldly assessed their options. The SS had orders that men who knew too much should not be captured alive. Von Braun intended to be captured by the right side. He judged that the Americans would treat them best, and just as importantly, that America had the wealth to let them keep building rockets. So he led his team south, away from the advancing Soviets, dodging both the enemy and his own SS minders. When the moment came, he sent his younger brother down a mountain road on a bicycle to find an American soldier and surrender the entire group. More than 100 of Germany's top rocket engineers walked into American hands, essentially by choice, carrying the knowledge locked in their heads. Von Braun, characteristically confident, later remarked that he had expected to be treated not as a prisoner, but as an asset. He was right, and the men now holding him faced a decision that would be argued about for the next 80 years. The problem was the law. President Truman had authorized bringing German specialists to America, but he had explicitly barred anyone who had been an active Nazi or a war criminal. And by that standard, many of the most valuable scientists were simply ineligible. Von Braun's own file described him as a security threat. So the men who ran the program found a way around their own president. Intelligence officers quietly rewrote the dossiers, bleaching out SS memberships, downgrading damning judgments, replacing the phrase ardent Nazi with bland assessments of good character. The scrubbed files were marked, so the story goes, with an ordinary paperclip, and that quiet clip of metal gave the whole operation its name. More than 1,600 German scientists and engineers were ultimately brought to the United States this way, their histories laundered on paper so they could pass through a door the law had bolted shut. It was, in the plainest terms, a government deceiving its own government, deciding that the enemy's talent was worth more than the truth about who these men had been. And so, Hitler's rocket team came to America, not to a prison, but to the desert of the American Southwest. They were housed at Fort Bliss in Texas and trucked out to the white sands of New Mexico to do the only thing they had ever really wanted to do: build and fly rockets, now with an entire superpower's resources behind them. At first, they were men in limbo. Prisoners of peace, some called themselves, technically detained, families still overseas, launching reassembled V2s into the desert sky for their new masters. But slowly, the arrangement was made permanent. Their wives and children were brought over. Their status was legalized, and the same engineers who had aimed rockets at London were quietly becoming American citizens, raising children who would grow up speaking English in a country that had officially never let them in. They had traded one flag for another and kept the only thing they truly served: the rocket. Whatever it carried, whoever it was for, the work went on. Then the Cold War handed them the future. When the Soviet Union stunned America by launching Sputnik in 1957, a terrified nation turned to the one team that had been dreaming of space all along. Von Braun and his Germans, transplanted now to Huntsville, Alabama, were suddenly not an embarrassment to be hidden, but a national asset to be celebrated. von Braun became a star. He appeared on television, charming and visionary, selling America on the dream of spaceflight in his soft German accent. And when President Kennedy pledged to land a man on the moon, it was von Braun's team that built the machine to do it. The Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever flown, a direct descendant of the V-2 scaled up to the size of a skyscraper. On that July morning in 1969, his rocket worked flawlessly. Von Braun stood in mission control as Apollo 11 lifted off, and a man who had built terror weapons for a dictator was reborn in the eyes of the world as the gentle genius who took humanity to the moon. The past had been not just forgiven, but forgotten for a while. But the past does not stay buried forever. As the decades passed and investigators pried open the sealed records, the laundered files began to surface, and the clean story of the space age started to come apart. The clearest reckoning fell on one of von Braun's closest colleagues, Arthur Rudolph, the production manager who had run operations at the Mittelwerk tunnels and who later managed the Saturn V program that launched Apollo. In the 1980s, Justice Department investigators concluded that his wartime role in the slave labor factory could not be excused by his achievements. Rather than face prosecution, Rudolph surrendered his American citizenship and left the country he had helped carry to the moon. Von Braun himself died in 1977. Honored, decorated, his darkest chapters still mostly in shadow. And a nation was left to sit with an uncomfortable truth, that its greatest triumph of light had been built, in part, by men who had served the century's greatest darkness, and that its own government had known and had chosen the rocket anyway. So, how do we weigh it? That is the question Operation Paperclip leaves in our hands, and it has never had a comfortable answer. On one side of the ledger, the satellites that watch our weather and carry our voices, the probes that have left the solar system, the footprints on the moon, an entire age of human achievement, accelerated by minds America chose to import. On the other side, 20,000 dead in a mountain of tunnels, a law deliberately broken, and a message sent to every talented monster who might follow, that if your gifts are valuable enough, your crimes can be quietly filed away under a paperclip. The men who made that bargain believed they were being practical. In a dangerous new world, they told themselves, you use the tools you can get, and you do not ask too many questions about where they came from. Perhaps they were right, perhaps the moon was worth it. But a country that decides some truths are too costly to look at has to wonder what else it has agreed not to see. And that is the file Operation Paperclip leaves open on the table. When the prize is big enough, is there any past we won't agree to forget? If you want the secrets of the last century brought into the light, subscribe to Cypherglass. We are decrypting the 20th century, one file at a time.